Men like you were made for carrying things, Desmond said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Plates, bags, other people's problems. That's the ceiling, and honestly, it suits you. The table laughed, every single one of them, and the man holding the water pitcher said nothing. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below, because what happened next in that dining room didn't just silence a billionaire. It dismantled him. In front of his board, his investors, and 2 journalists who had come to write about his charity work. This isn't a story about a server getting even. It's about what happens when power spends so long looking down, it forgets to look across. Marcus Hale had been awake since 5:30 that morning. Not because of the shift, he'd worked stranger hours than a Saturday evening gala. He was awake because Lily had had one of her bad nights, the kind where the medication kept her restless, and he'd sit at the edge of her bed doing nothing useful, just being there. Which was the only thing that seemed to help. By 6, he'd given up on sleep entirely, made her the oatmeal she liked with the sliced banana arranged in a smiley face, and watched her eat it with the particular concentration of a child who had learned not to rush good things. She was 9 years old and already more patient than most adults he'd ever worked with. He'd ironed his work shirt at the kitchen counter while she finished breakfast, which was not where shirts were supposed to be ironed, but the board had been stored behind a box in the closet for 8 months, and he'd never quite gotten around to retrieving it. The shirt came out fine. It always did. Marcus had a way of making imperfect conditions produce acceptable results, something that had served him well in rooms far more demanding than this kitchen, in roles he no longer carried a title for. The framed photograph on the windowsill caught the morning light the way it always did around 6:45. A government building atrium, marble floors, a younger version of him in a dark suit receiving something from a man in a better suit. He'd stopped noticing it years ago the way you stop noticing a scar. It's there. It's part of the landscape. It doesn't require daily acknowledgement. Lily's appointment was at 9. Dr. Fennick ran a tight schedule and Marcus respected that. They took the bus because parking near the hospital district was a particular form of financial punishment he saw no reason to volunteer for, and Lily liked the bus anyway. She liked watching the city move past the window and naming things. Bakery. Dog. That building's very tall. Man with a blue umbrella. She cataloged the world with quiet enthusiasm, and Marcus cataloged her cataloging it, which was its own kind of piece. The waiting room at the specialist's office had a row of chairs along a wall and a cluster of small tables with magazines no one read. Marcus sat beside Lily with a paperback he'd borrowed from the building's lobby exchange shelf, someone's discarded thriller, decent enough, and read to her in a low voice while she leaned against his arm. 3 chairs down, a man in a tailored blazer typed rapidly on a laptop. His daughter beside him building something out of the waiting room's small basket of Lego with the focused self-sufficiency of a child accustomed to occupying herself. Marcus noticed the girl. He usually noticed the children first. Dr. Fennick said what she'd said for the past 4 months. Stable, monitoring, adjusting the evening dosage by a small margin to address the restless nights. Marcus asked 2 questions, wrote the answers in the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, and thanked her the way he thanked everyone who did their job well and deserved to know it. They were back on the bus by 10:40. Lily pressed her palm against the window as they passed a fountain in the civic square, water catching the late morning sun. "It looks like it's full of diamonds," she said. "It does," Marcus agreed. She thought about that for a moment. Do you think the people who built it knew it would do that? He considered the question seriously, the way she deserved. "I think some of them did," he said, "and I think some of them were just trying to build something good, and the diamonds were a bonus." She seemed satisfied with that. She leaned back against him and watched the fountain until it disappeared behind a building. His shift started at 5. He'd have her settled with the neighbor who watched her on his evening shifts, uniform pressed, on the bus downtown, by 4:15. He didn't know yet what the evening would cost him, or what it would return. The Velthorpe Grand Hotel did not advertise itself. It didn't need to. It sat at the corner of Meridian and 5th like a statement, 12 stories of pale limestone and brass fittings, the kind of building that had decided long ago it was above signage. The city knew where it was. The people who mattered knew how to get in. Everyone else was scenery. Marcus came in through the service entrance on Callaway Lane, the way he always did, the way all of them did, a narrow door beside a loading dock that smelled of industrial detergent and last night's kitchen exhaust. He badged in, collected his apron and order pad from the staff room, and listened to the floor manager, a compact woman named Deb, run through the evening's parameters with the efficiency of someone who had done this 400 times and intended to do it 400 more. The Varotech Annual Charity Gala. 340 guests. 7-course tasting menu. 2 vegetarian tables, 1 kosher station, 1 table, with a nut allergy so severe that Deb said the word severe twice, and made eye contact with everyone individually when she said it. Open bar from 7, speeches at 9. The client expected invisible service, present when needed, absent when not, and never, under any circumstances, the subject of anyone's attention. Marcus wrote nothing down. He didn't need to. Around him, the other servers were adjusting collar buttons and comparing section assignments. He'd been given the center floor, the prestige tables, where the most important guests sat and where the margin for error was thinnest. Deb gave him that assignment without discussion, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. You didn't explain why you gave your best section to your best person. You just did it and moved on. He spent 20 minutes before service walking the floor. This was something he'd always done, not because it was required, but because a room was a system, and systems rewarded people who understood them before they were under pressure. He noted the sightlines from each table to the kitchen doors. He identified the 2 centerpieces whose bases were sitting slightly uneven on the tablecloths, the kind of minor instability that became a problem when someone gestured too broadly mid-conversation. He repositioned them both with 2 fingers, small adjustments, barely visible. He checked the water station nearest his section and found one of the pitchers had a hairline chip along the pour lip. He swapped it without ceremony. The ballroom itself was a particular kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with warmth. It was the beauty of expense, of surfaces that reflected light because they'd been selected to, of flowers that had traveled farther than most of the guests' morning commutes, of a ceiling fixture that probably cost more than Marcus's annual rent and illuminated nothing you couldn't have. Illuminated more cheaply. He didn't resent it. He'd worked in rooms like this long enough that the opulence had become neutral information like weather. What he noticed instead was the layout, the acoustics, the fact that sound carried differently near the east wall than the west, which meant conversations at the center tables would be audible, really audible, to the surrounding floor if voices rose above a certain register. He filed that away for no particular reason. At 6:50, the guests began arriving, and the room transformed the way expensive rooms did. It absorbed the people designed for it, and made them look inevitable. Women in gowns that cost what Marcus made in a month. Men in suits cut close enough to suggest they'd been measured recently. The soft percussion of heels on marble, the ambient music from the quartet in the corner, the precise choreography of 300 people performing the version of themselves they'd decided tonight deserved. Marcus moved through it all the way water moves through stone, present, purposeful, leaving no mark. It was near the end of the first course that he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the room near the service corridor entrance, which was an unusual place for someone in a gown that expensive to be standing. Dark hair, early 40s, the particular posture of someone whose job required her to be ready for anything at any given moment. She was looking at her phone, then at the room, then back at her phone, with the focused distraction of someone managing 16 things and pretending to manage only one. She glanced up as Marcus passed with a tray, and their eyes met for half a second. Something moved across her face. Not recognition, exactly. More like the edge of it. A word on the tip of a tongue. She looked away first. Marcus continued toward table 7. If you want to know what she was almost remembering and why it would change everything by the end of this night, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is only getting started, and you will not want to miss what comes next. He refilled the water glasses and moved on. Desmond Varro arrived at 8:14, which was intentional. Not late enough to be rude, late enough to be noticed. There was a calibration to it, the kind of entrance that only worked if the room was already full, already settled, already committed to its own conversations, so that the interruption of his arrival could ripple outward from the door like a stone dropped in still water. He'd been doing it for years. He knew exactly what it cost him in logistics and exactly what it returned in presence. The room responded the way rooms always did. Heads turned. Conversation softened at the edges. The quartet adjusted almost imperceptibly, not stopping, just accommodating, the way music does when something louder enters. He was taller than most people expected from his photographs. 6'2", broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that had been made for him in a city he visited twice a year specifically for that purpose. His hair was the distinguished kind of silver that arrived early in wealthy families and was received as an asset. He moved through the room with the particular ease of a man who had decided long ago that spaces existed to receive him, and had never been seriously contradicted. Marcus watched him from the water station near the east wall. Not with judgment. With the same attention he gave everything in his section, neutral, observational, the quiet data gathering of someone who understood that the most useful information was usually collected before anything happened. Desmond Varro was, from a service perspective, a specific type of guest, the kind whose needs were partly logistical and partly performative, which meant you had to anticipate what he actually required and separately anticipate what he needed to be seen receiving. They were not always the same thing. He worked the room in a wide arc before finding his table. Marcus tracked the arc without appearing to. Desmond moved from cluster to cluster with the efficiency of someone for whom small talk was a professional discipline rather than a social instinct. A hand on a shoulder here. A laugh deployed precisely there, not too long, never self-deprecating enough to suggest vulnerability. He collected people the way a room collected light, drawing them toward him and then releasing them slightly diminished as though proximity to him had transferred something in his direction. His table was the center table. Of course it was. 8 guests, all of them the kind of people whose names appeared in the financial press without irony, board members, a senator's chief economic advisor, 2 investors whose combined portfolio could have funded a small nation's infrastructure program, and a woman Marcus would later learn was a journalist from a publication that covered technology and power with the particular appetite of someone who enjoyed watching both be tested. Desmond sat. The table reorganized itself around him without being asked. His head of security, a quiet man named Rourke who wore his earpiece like punctuation, stationed himself near the east wall, close enough to respond, far enough to be deniable. Marcus had already noted where Rourke stood. They'd exchanged nods the way professionals in adjacent fields sometimes did, a brief acknowledgement of shared competence with no further elaboration required. The first course arrived at Desmond's table at 8:22. Marcus served it. Desmond didn't look at him. This was standard. Some guests treated servers as furniture, some treated them as staff, and a small number treated them as people, and the distribution across those categories mapped quite reliably onto other things Marcus had noticed about those same guests over the years. He adjusted his assessment of Desmond Varro accordingly, and moved on. By the third course, the table was fully alive with the specific energy of powerful people competing to be the most relaxed version of themselves. Desmond led this the way he led everything, by setting the temperature and letting others find their place within it. He was, Marcus noted with professional detachment, genuinely good at this. The charm was real enough, even if the warmth behind it wasn't. The senator's advisor said something about regulatory frameworks. One of the investors offered a counterpoint. The journalist listened with the quality of attention that meant she was recording everything without recording anything. Desmond leaned back in his chair and smiled the smile of a man who had already decided how every conversation in this room would end. He had no idea, in that moment, that two things were already in motion that would dismantle that certainty entirely. One of them was a hairline fracture spreading silently through the architecture of his digital empire, 200 miles away in a server room that hummed with the sound of his entire fortune breathing. The other was Marcus, moving quietly toward his table with a water pitcher, watching the centerpiece on the far end begin its slow, almost imperceptible tilt. The centerpiece was a tall arrangement, white orchids in a glass vessel, elegant and entirely impractical, the kind of thing chosen for photographs rather than tables where people actually moved their arms. Marcus had flagged it during his pre-service walk, noted the uneven base, made an adjustment. But the tablecloth had shifted slightly during the third-course service, and now the vessel was doing what poorly balanced things on uneven surfaces eventually did. He saw it from 4 steps away. The woman beside it was 70, maybe 72, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a brooch on her left shoulder that Marcus recognized as the kind of thing inherited rather than purchased. She was mid-conversation, animated, her right hand gesturing in the direction of the vessel without knowing it. One more gesture like that and the orchids were going over, directly into her lap, glass and water and all. Marcus covered the remaining steps in a single smooth movement, set the pitcher down with his left hand and caught the base of the vessel with his right, stabilizing it without sound, without interruption, without drawing a single eye from the conversation happening around him. He held it for 3 seconds while quietly repositioning it on the tablecloth, then retrieved the pitcher and resumed his approach to refill the glasses on the far side. The elderly woman never broke her sentence. That was the half-second pause that Desmond Varro noticed. Not the catch, not the woman, not the vessel that would have shattered across her lap. Just the pause, the fractional delay between Marcus arriving at the table's edge and beginning to pour. One beat off the rhythm Desmond had apparently decided was acceptable, and that, for reasons that lived somewhere in the architecture of who Desmond Varro was and what he needed a Saturday evening to confirm about the world, was enough. "Slow night for you?" Desmond said. His voice carried. The acoustics near the center tables were exactly what Marcus had noted during his walk. Sound moved outward here, clean and unobstructed, reaching the surrounding floor without effort. Several heads at the adjacent table turned before Desmond had finished the sentence. Marcus continued pouring. "I'll have you taken care of shortly, sir. I'm sure you will." Desmond picked up his wine glass, examined it with the theatrical attention of someone who wanted to be seen examining it. "I'm just saying, I've seen faster movement from men twice your age. Must be a long week." The table offered the expected light laughter, the social contract of power. When the most important person at the table performs amusement, Others locate their amusement quickly. Marcus set the pitcher down. He looked at Desmond with an expression that gave nothing away, not deference, not defiance, simply the level gaze of a man who had been looked at dismissively by people with considerably more authority than this, and had learned that such moments passed. "Can I get you anything else?" he said. That calm, apparently, was the wrong answer. Something sharpened in Desmond's expression, the micro-irritation of a man who expected friction and received none, and found the absence of friction more offensive than friction would have been. He set his glass down and leaned back in his chair, and when he spoke again the performance quality of it had increased, pitched now not just for the table, but for the surrounding floor. "You know what I find fascinating?" he said, addressing the table but watching Marcus. "The way some men just settle. You can see it in how they carry themselves. No ambition, no edge. Just," he gestured vaguely at Marcus's uniform, plates and pitchers until the lights go out. He shook his head with the practiced sorrow of a man who found other people's limitations personally disappointing. "I built 3 companies by the time I was your age. What do you suppose the difference is?" The table had gone the specific quiet of people who were uncomfortable and had decided that discomfort was someone else's problem. The journalist was watching with her glass halfway to her mouth. Marcus stood at the edge of the table for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. He looked at Desmond Varro. Really looked at him, the way you look at something you are deciding whether to engage with or simply move past, and then he set the water pitcher down on the service tray, straightened his jacket, and said, quietly and without any particular emotion, "I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, sir." He turned and walked back toward the service station. Behind him, Desmond said something to the table that drew louder laughter than the first. Marcus didn't hear the exact words. He didn't need to. He was already thinking about Lily, about whether she'd managed to sleep, about the small notebook in his jacket pocket with Dr. Fenwick's adjusted dosage written in his careful handwriting. He was not thinking about Desmond Varro. Not yet. The service corridor behind the ballroom was 12 feet wide and lit with the particular fluorescence of spaces not meant to be seen. Functional, unsparing. The kind of light that showed everything. Stainless steel carts lined the left wall. The right wall had a row of hooks where aprons hung between courses. The floor was the linoleum Marcus had noted on his first shift here 6 months ago, worn in a path down the center from decades of people moving quickly between the kitchen and the door. He stood at the far end, near the staff phone station, and called Clara, the retired schoolteacher 2 floors below him who watched Lily on his evening shifts. Clara answered on the second ring the way she always did, promptly, without alarm, which was itself a form of kindness. Lily was asleep, had gone down without trouble, which meant the adjusted dosage was already doing something useful. Clara had read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through, and Lily had requested a 3rd chapter, and then been asleep before the 3rd chapter was 4 pages in, which Clara reported with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had won a minor and pleasant negotiation. Marcus thanked her. He meant it the way he meant most things, completely and without elaboration. He hung up and stood for a moment in the fluorescent quiet. The dining room noise was muffled here, reduced to a low murmur that moved through the walls like something underwater. He could hear the kitchen. The specific controlled chaos of 7 courses being choreographed under pressure, the clatter and call of it, the heat of it coming through the door in warm pulses whenever someone pushed through. He breathed it in and let the moment be what it was. He wasn't angry. This was something people sometimes found difficult to believe about him, and he understood why. A man is publicly reduced in a room full of witnesses, and the expected response is heat, resentment, wounded pride, the particular burn of humiliation that sits in the chest and demands acknowledgement. Marcus felt none of it, or rather felt it briefly and then placed it somewhere quiet, the way you place a glass on a shelf, present, contained, no longer in your hand. He'd been spoken to worse, by people with considerably more legitimate authority, in rooms where the stakes had been considerably higher, in situations where the right to be angry was both warranted and completely irrelevant. He'd learned a long time ago that anger was expensive, and he ran a careful budget. He checked his watch. 12 minutes before the fourth course, he straightened his jacket, picked up his tray, and turned back toward the ballroom door. That was when he almost walked directly into Priya Solis. She was standing just inside the corridor entrance with her phone in one hand and an expression that Marcus had seen before on people who were trying to reconcile two pieces of information that didn't quite fit together yet. She was looking at him with the particular focus of someone who had stopped moving specifically because he was there. "I'm sorry," she said, and then didn't move. Marcus waited. "This is going to sound strange," she said. "All right." She glanced at her phone screen, then back at him. "Did you work for Novatire Federal Systems?" The question landed in the corridor the way certain questions do, with a weight that suggested the person asking already suspected the answer and was giving you the opportunity to confirm it before they acted on it. Marcus looked at her for a moment. She was mid-40s, precise in the way of someone whose job required precision, and she was holding her phone with the screen toward her chest now, which meant she'd found something she wasn't sure she should have found. "That was a few years ago," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not surprised, she'd been moving toward this conclusion for a while. He could see that. More like the specific feeling of a lock turning over. "I thought I recognized you," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "Your posture, the way she stopped, started again. I attended a federal infrastructure briefing in 2021. You presented the Novatire security architecture to a joint oversight panel." She paused. "You had different hair." Marcus said nothing. Priya looked at her phone again. Whatever she'd found there, a profile, a photograph, a name attached to a title that didn't match the apron in front of her, she looked at it for 3 seconds, and then looked back at him with an expression that had moved past surprise and into something more serious. "I need to make a call," she said, more to herself than to him. She was already turning away when Marcus spoke. "Fourth course starts in 10 minutes, he said evenly. "I need to get back to the floor." She nodded without turning around, her phone already at her ear. If you want to know who she was calling and why that call would bring the entire room to a standstill within the hour, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next part of this story is where everything begins to turn. Marcus pushed through the ballroom door and walked back into the light. Priya Solis did not go back to her table immediately. She stood in the narrow alcove between the service corridor and the east hallway, a transitional space, neither ballroom nor backstage, the kind of architectural in-between that hotels built without intending to give anyone a place to fall apart quietly. She had her back to the wall and her phone pressed to her ear, and she was waiting for Agent Theo Burke to pick up with the specific patience of someone who knew the call was too important to leave a voicemail for. He answered on the 4th ring, "Priya." His voice had the quality of someone working late who had expected the phone to ring eventually. "It's been a while." "It has." She kept her voice low, angled away from the ballroom noise leaking under the door. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." A pause. "All right. Marcus Hale, former director of cyber infrastructure at Novatire Federal." She looked at the photograph she'd pulled up on her phone, a federal briefing document, partially redacted, his face clear in the panel photograph. Is he still considered a valid resource? If something came up in his area? The silence on the other end was brief, but specific. The silence of someone recalibrating what kind of conversation they were in. Why are you asking me that tonight? Burke said. Because he's here, Priya said. He's working the gala I'm attending. As a server. Another silence. Longer this time. Priya. Burke's voice had changed register, quieter, more careful. Is this a social call, or do you have a reason to be concerned about something? She thought about that, about the way she'd watched him move through the dining room earlier, that precise, unhurried economy of motion that didn't belong to someone who'd spent their career carrying trays. About the way he'd caught the centerpiece without breaking stride, without drawing attention, with the automatic competence of someone trained to manage instability before it became a problem. About the look on his face when Desmond had performed his contempt for the table, not wounded, not diminished, just patient in a way that suggested he was waiting for something to pass rather than reacting to something that had landed. I don't have a reason, she said carefully. I wanted to know if the answer was yes. The answer, Burke said slowly, is that Marcus Hale is on a short list of people this division would contact if certain categories of infrastructure problem became active. His clearance lapsed when he left Nova Tire, but his knowledge didn't. A pause. He designed the system, Priya. You can't revoke that. She closed her eyes briefly. Thank you, she said. That's all I needed. She hung up and stood in the alcove with the ambient noise of the gala pressing softly through the walls around her. The quartet. The conversation. The precise rhythm of a room full of powerful people enjoying an evening that was, as far as any of them knew, going exactly as planned. Her champagne was still on the table inside, untouched and certainly warm by now. She didn't go back for it. Instead, she opened her email and pulled up the thread she'd been half monitoring since before dinner, the running operations update from Varotech's infrastructure team that she received automatically as chief of staff and almost never needed to read at a gala. She scrolled past the 7:15 update, which had been routine, and found the 8:43 entry, which was not. The language was technical and carefully restrained in the way that internal communications were when the people writing them were trying not to cause panic while clearly being panicked. Words like anomalous cascade and containment protocol initiated and status, monitoring that, to someone who had spent 4 years sitting adjacent to the technology division and absorbing its vocabulary by proximity, translated fairly cleanly into, something is wrong, and we do not yet know how wrong. She read it twice. Then she looked at the ballroom door. Desmond was in there, performing the version of himself that this room had paid to see. Confident, magnetic, untouchable. His technology team was 200 miles away watching something they didn't fully understand yet deteriorate in a direction they couldn't control, and in the service corridor on the other side of the same wall, a man in a white apron possessed the precise knowledge required to understand both the problem and its solution, because he had built the architecture that was currently being turned against itself. The irony of it was so complete, it almost had a shape. Priya put her phone in her clutch and straightened the way she did when she'd made a decision and was moving toward it. She wasn't doing this for Desmond. She'd worked for him long enough to hold no particular illusions about what he deserved from an evening like this one. She was doing it because the operations report had mentioned 3 financial institutions whose client data was currently sitting inside that compromised system, and because at the scale they were talking about, this stopped being a corporate problem and became something else entirely. She pushed open the ballroom door. The room received her the way it always did, without noticing. She scanned the floor until she found Marcus near the service station at the far west wall, refilling a tray with the same quiet attention he'd brought to every task she'd watched him perform tonight. She began moving toward him, threading between tables, her expression arranged into something that would not cause alarm to anyone watching. She was halfway across the floor when her phone vibrated in her clutch. She already knew who it was before she looked. Burke. Calling back. She answered it mid-stride and listened for 11 seconds and then stopped walking entirely in the middle of the ballroom floor, because what he'd said in those 11 seconds had changed the specific weight of everything that was about to happen. "It's active," Burke said. As of 9 minutes ago, it crossed the federal notification threshold. Priya stood perfectly still in the middle of the ballroom floor, with 300 people moving around her like water around a stone. A waiter passed on her left with a dessert tray. Someone laughed at the table nearest her. A bright social laugh that belonged to a completely different evening than the one she was now standing inside. "How bad?" she said quietly. "Bad enough that I'm calling you back." A pause, and she could hear keyboard movement in the background, the particular rapid rhythm of people working a problem under pressure. 3 enterprise clients are financial institutions. Live transaction architecture. The attack vector is using the system's own logic against itself. Our analysts are saying whoever is in there knows the original design intimately, not just the documentation, the actual decision-making behind the build. She started walking again. Slower now, more deliberate. "Your team can't contain it?" "We've had 4 people on it since the alert triggered. They're working from the recovery protocol documentation." Another pause. The protocol isn't holding. Whatever this is, it was built to defeat the documented response. Which means the person who designed the system is the only one who knows what the documentation doesn't say, Priya finished. Silence on the line. "Where is he?" Burke said. She was already looking at him. Marcus was at the West Service Station, his back to the room, resetting a tray with the methodical attention he brought to everything. 20 feet away. In a white apron, completely unaware that the problem he'd spent the most significant years of his professional life building a solution for had just become active on a Saturday evening while he was refilling water glasses at a charity gala. "Close," she said. "I'll call you back in 2 minutes." She hung up and covered the remaining distance to the service station with the kind of pace that was just below the threshold of visibly urgent, fast enough to mean business, controlled enough not to alarm the room. Marcus. He turned. His expression when he looked at her was the same it had been in the corridor, open, unhurried, giving nothing away. "I need a moment," she said. "Please." Something in the quality of her voice must have communicated what the words didn't, because he set the tray down without question and turned to face her fully. She was aware of the room around them, the ambient noise, the movement, the fact that Desmond's table was 40 feet away, and Desmond was currently holding court on some point of business that had the table nodding in the performative agreement of people who found agreement professionally useful. She kept her voice low. "There's a situation developing with Varotech's primary data infrastructure," she said. "I've been on the phone with the FBI's cyber division. They have analysts working it right now, and the containment protocol isn't holding." She watched his face as she said the next part. "The attack is using the system's own architecture against itself. Burke's team believes it requires someone with original design knowledge to address it in real time." Marcus looked at her for a moment without speaking. His expression didn't change in the way she'd half expected, no sudden alertness, no visible shift into a different mode. If anything, he went more still, which she was beginning to understand was what it looked like when he was processing something quickly and completely. "Which system?" he said. "The Novatire core. The cloud infrastructure licensing. I know which licensing," he said quietly. "Which layer is compromised?" The question was so precise and so immediate that it stopped her for a half-second. "I don't," Burke would know. "He's waiting for me to call back." Marcus looked past her toward the ballroom, not at anything specific, the look of someone running a rapid internal calculation. Then he looked back at her. "Call him," he said. "Put it on speaker." She already had the phone out. Burke answered before the second ring, and Priya held the phone between them, low, angled away from the nearest table. "Burke," she said, "I have Marcus Hale." A beat of silence on the line that carried its own specific weight. "Mr. Hale." Burke's voice shifted, not deferential exactly, but recalibrated, the way professionals recalibrate when they're speaking to someone who outranks their problem. "We have a cascade failure originating in the authentication layer that's migrating toward the transaction processing core. The vector is recursive trust exploitation," Marcus said. "Someone fed the verification system a credential chain it recognizes as internal. It's been authenticating the attack because it thinks it's authenticating itself." Complete silence on the line. Then Burke said, carefully, "That is exactly what our analysts just concluded after 40 minutes of work." "There's a manual override," Marcus said. "It's not in the documentation." "Mr. Hale." "It was a contingency I built into the original architecture for exactly this scenario. It requires a 12-character sequence entered directly into the primary console, physical access or level 1 remote, which means someone on your team needs clearance to." "We have level 1 remote," Burke said, and Marcus could hear the controlled urgency underneath the professional composure. "We have it right now." "What's the sequence?" Marcus was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Priya watched his face during those 3 seconds, watched him make a decision that had nothing to do with Desmond Varro or the evening's humiliation, or any of the things that would have been entirely reasonable to factor into the calculation. He was somewhere else entirely. In the architecture of the thing, running his hands along walls he'd built years ago in the dark, finding the door he'd left there for exactly this kind of night. "Get your analyst to the primary console," he said, "and get me something to write on." Priya reached into her clutch and produced a card and a pen without hesitation. Marcus took them, turned the card over to its blank side, and began writing. The Matrides podium stood at the threshold between the ballroom and the reception foyer, a mahogany lectern with a brass lamp and a surface just wide enough to hold an open reservation book and, as it turned out, a laptop belonging to Varotech's CTO who had materialized via video call on Priya's device with the specific pallor of a man who had aged 4 years in the last 40 minutes. His name was Gordon Fitch, and he was 53 years old and had run technology operations for Desmond Varro for 6 years, and in all of that time he had never made a call to his employer during a Saturday gala because Gordon Fitch was the kind of man who solved problems before they required that kind of call. Tonight he had failed to be that kind of man, and it showed in every pixel of his face on the screen. Priya had positioned the laptop on the podium at Priya's suggestion. It was the only flat surface near the ballroom entrance, with adequate light and enough distance from the dining tables to conduct a technical conversation without broadcasting it to 300 guests. Marcus stood in front of it in his white server's apron, the card with the sequence in his left hand, Burke's analyst on speakerphone through Priya's cell. He looked, objectively, like a man who had wandered into the wrong meeting. He did not behave like one. "Walk me through what your console is showing," he said to the analyst on the phone. His voice had a quality now that hadn't been present during the dinner service, not louder, not harder, but with a specific gravity that suggested this was the register he'd operated in for most of his professional life, and the apron was the aberration, not the voice. The analyst, young, female, clearly running on adrenaline and training, read out the console display with impressive precision. Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes on the middle distance, processing. "Stop there," he said. The third line. "What's the timestamp differential between the authentication request and the system's response?" A pause. Keyboard sounds. 47 milliseconds. "It should be 12, Marcus said. That gap is the exploit window. The attack is inserting into that space, it's using the processing delay to substitute credentials mid-verification. He looked at Fitch on the screen. This is why your protocol isn't holding. The documentation describes the exploit as a front door problem. It's not. It's happening in the hallway. Fitch stared at him. Who? He stopped. Looked at Priya. Who is this? The person solving your problem, Priya said. Keep going. Something was happening at the edges of the ballroom. It was subtle, the kind of shift that rooms made when attention began redistributing without announcement. A few of the guests nearest the foyer threshold had angled themselves slightly toward the podium, drawn by the low-urgent quality of the conversation and the sight of Varotech's CTO on a laptop screen looking like the floor had dropped beneath him. One of the servers had stopped mid-circuit and was watching from near the east wall with the frozen attention of someone who couldn't identify what they were seeing but understood it mattered. Marcus was aware of none of this in any way that affected what he was doing. He was talking the analyst through the pre-sequence steps, the specific console pathway that would allow the override to function, which required 3 preparatory inputs before the 12-character sequence itself, none of which were documented anywhere because he had built them as a silent safeguard, the kind of redundancy that existed specifically because the documented safeguards could be studied and therefore defeated. Second preparatory input, he said. It's going to ask for a system identifier. The field will look like it wants your standard node code. It doesn't. Enter the original Novatire project designation, November Tango Sierra -001. Keyboard sounds. It's, the analyst said, and then a pause that contained something that might have been relief trying to present itself professionally. It's accepting it. Third input is a timestamp, Marcus said. Not current time. Original system initialization date. February 14th, 2019. Format it, year, month, day. More keyboard sounds. He could hear in the texture of the silence on the line the specific quality of a room full of people watching something work. Subscribe and stay with us, because in the next part of this story, the room inside that ballroom is about to experience the same thing, and the man who set all of this in motion has no idea it's coming. It's holding, the analyst said. The cascade is, Mr. Hale. The cascade is reversing. The authentication layer is stabilizing. Marcus looked at the card in his hand. You ready for the primary sequence? Ready. He read it out. 12 characters, delivered with the unhurried precision of someone who had written this contingency into the original architecture years ago against the possibility of exactly this night, never knowing the night would look like this. The silence afterward had a different texture than the silences before it. It's clean, the analyst said. Her voice had dropped to something that was almost quiet. Mr. Hale, the system is clean. All 3 financial institution partitions they're intact. Transaction architecture is stable. The intrusion has been fully expelled. Fitch on the laptop screen put his hand over his mouth. Priya stood very still beside the podium. Marcus set the card down on the mahogany surface and looked at the laptop screen where Gordon Fitch was doing the specific thing that men of a certain professional composure did when they had just watched something catastrophic become something manageable. He was breathing, deliberately, like a man reminding himself how. Thank you, Fitch said. The 2 words were doing significant structural work. Marcus nodded once. Make sure your team patches the timestamp gap in the next maintenance window, he said. And update the protocol documentation. Someone else could find that exploit. Then he straightened, picked up his order pad from the podium edge where he'd set it when Priya first approached him, and looked toward the ballroom. The 4th course had long since been cleared. The 5th was overdue. The ballroom had developed a quality that Marcus noticed the moment he stepped back through the threshold, a particular kind of charged stillness that rooms acquired when something had happened at their edges that most people hadn't fully seen but had somehow registered anyway. The quartet was still playing. Conversations were still running, but there was a subtle reorientation in the room, the way a field of grass all leans the same direction after wind has passed through it, that told anyone paying attention that the evening had shifted on its axis without announcing the shift. Several guests near the foyer entrance had watched the podium exchange. Not with full understanding, they'd seen a server, a laptop, an urgent phone call, a woman in an expensive gown standing very still beside a man in an apron with the focused attention of someone watching a surgeon work. The image didn't resolve into a clear narrative at that distance, but it lodged. Marcus picked up his service rhythm where he'd left it. This was partly discipline and partly something more fundamental the work needed doing, and he was still on shift, and those two facts existed independent of everything else that had happened in the last 40 minutes. He collected the overdue fifth course from the kitchen with an apology to the sous chef for the timing disruption, an apology the sous chef received with the weary pragmatism of someone who had learned that gala service operated on its own logic, and began moving through his section with the same unhurried precision he'd brought to the evening from the start. The room watched him without appearing to watch him. This was the thing about a room that had partially witnessed something. It didn't stop performing its own function, but it developed a peripheral awareness, a slight tracking quality, like eyes following movement without the head turning. Marcus moved through this ambient attention the way he moved through everything, neither seeking it nor deflecting it, simply present inside it. At Desmond's table, the conversation had thinned. This was notable because Desmond's table had been the room's loudest and most performative corner all evening, a self-sustaining system of wit and deal-making and careful social positioning that had barely paused between courses. Now there were gaps in it, conversational spaces that weren't being filled at the usual speed. The investor to Desmond's left was checking his phone with the slight frown of someone who had received a notification he wasn't sure how to interpret. The journalist had her own phone face up on the table, which was unusual, and she was glancing at it with the particular attentiveness of someone monitoring a developing situation. Desmond himself was talking, but the room had stopped fully listening, and somewhere beneath the performance he was beginning to feel it. Marcus set down the fifth course at the table's far end and worked his way around. When he reached Desmond's position, he set the plate with the same quiet efficiency he'd brought to every other plate at every other table, and straightened and would have moved on. "Hey." Desmond's voice, quieter than before. The performance register was gone. This was something closer to his actual voice, which was lower and less certain than the one he'd used earlier in the evening. Marcus stopped. Desmond was looking at him with an expression that Marcus recognized. He'd seen it on faces of people at various points in his career. The specific expression that appeared when someone was trying to reconcile two versions of a person and finding that the versions didn't fit in the same frame. There was something working behind his eyes that wasn't quite understanding yet, but was moving toward it. "You were at the podium," Desmond said. Not an accusation, almost a question. "Yes, sir, with Gordon." He meant Fitch, my CTO. There was a situation that required some assistance. Desmond looked at him for a moment. Around the table, the conversations had gone quiet in the gradual way of people who had decided that the exchange happening at the table center was more interesting than their own. The investor with the phone had put the phone down. The journalist had not looked at her device in 30 seconds. "What kind of situation?" Desmond said. Marcus considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything. "The kind that's been resolved," he said. It was the board member to Desmond's right, a man named Castellan, silver-haired and sharp, who had been at the Nova Tire licensing table 3 years ago and had a memory for faces that had served him extremely well across a 40-year career. Who said it? Quietly, almost to himself, but in the specific silence that had settled over the table, it carried. "My God," Castellan said. He was looking at Marcus with an expression of undisguised recognition. "You're Marcus Hale." The name landed in the silence like a stone in still water, and the ripples moved outward immediately, across the table to the adjacent tables, caught by the journalist whose head came up sharply, absorbed by the investor who had spent 3 years on the board of a company that had licensed the Novatire architecture and knew exactly what that name meant in that context. Desmond looked at Castellan, then back at Marcus. "Who is Marcus Hale?" he said. The question was genuine, and in its genuineness it was, in its own way, the most damning thing Desmond Varro had said all evening, because Castellan's expression in response to it made clear, without a word, that not knowing the answer was its own kind of verdict. Castellan looked at Desmond for a moment with the patient gravity of someone who was about to explain something that should not have required explanation. "He's the man who built the system your entire cloud empire runs on," Castellan said. And apparently, he looked at Marcus with something that might have been admiration, or apology, or both. The man who just saved it. The table did not erupt. That was the thing about rooms full of powerful people. They didn't erupt. They absorbed, they processed. And then they reconfigured, quietly and completely, the way a current changes direction beneath a surface that looks the same from above. But the reconfiguration was total. Castellan's words moved through the table and then beyond it with the particular velocity of information that reframes everything preceding it. The investor to Desmond's left, who had been monitoring his phone with the vague unease of someone who'd received fragmented notifications about a Varro Tech infrastructure event, now put the phone face down with the deliberate calm of a man who had just understood the complete picture and needed a moment to absorb it. The board member across the table said nothing but sat back in his chair with the specific quality of someone who was revising an entire evening's worth of observation in real time. The journalist had her phone in her hand. She wasn't pretending otherwise. She was looking at Marcus with the focused attention of someone whose entire professional instinct had just fired simultaneously on every frequency, and she was making the calculation that journalists made in moments like this: how much of what she'd witnessed was on record, how much was inference, and how quickly she could confirm the parts that weren't yet solid. She'd watched the mockery. She'd watched the podium. She'd heard Castellan. She was already writing the story in the architecture of her mind, and Marcus could see it happening, and it didn't change what he did next, which was to stand at the edge of the table and wait with the same unhurried composure he'd maintained all evening. Desmond had gone very still. This was new. All evening he had been in motion, gesturing, leaning, performing the various physical expressions of a man who owned the room's attention. Now he was sitting with a quality of stillness that suggested the motion had not stopped voluntarily, but had simply run out. He was looking at Marcus with an expression that was trying to be several things at once and not quite managing any of them. Composure, authority, recalibration, and underneath all of those attempts was something simpler and more honest, which was the specific discomfort of a man who had made a very public error and was now sitting inside the full visibility of it. "The Novatire architecture," Desmond said. His voice was careful now, measured. "That's the system we licensed in 2019, Castellan said. The licensing deal took 8 months to negotiate. The architecture was the crown jewel of the acquisition. He looked at Marcus. "I was at 3 of those negotiating sessions. You presented the security framework to our board." Marcus nodded once, and tonight, the investor said slowly, Not quite as a question. You were working. He gestured at the apron, the order pad, the service tray at Marcus's elbow, and then stopped, because the gesture made the sentence unnecessary. I work here on weekends, Marcus said. The simplicity of it landed harder than any elaboration would have. The silence that followed had a texture to it, not uncomfortable exactly, but dense with the weight of everything being reconsidered. People at adjacent tables had abandoned any pretense of their own conversations. The story had moved beyond Desmond's table now, carried on the low current of the room's awareness, and faces were turned with the open attention of people who had stopped performing indifference. From across the room, Priya watched. She had returned to her position near the east wall after the podium, close enough to observe, far enough to give the moment its space. She was watching Desmond with the careful attention of someone who had worked for him long enough to know which version of him appeared under genuine pressure, as opposed to the performed pressure he occasionally deployed for effect. What she was seeing now was the genuine version, and it was considerably quieter than the performed one. The journalist spoke for the first time. Mr. Hale. Her voice was measured, professional, carrying the particular neutrality of someone who had learned to ask questions without telegraphing the answer they expected. Would you be willing to speak with me briefly after the event? Marcus looked at her. I'm working until 11, he said, and then I need to get home to my daughter. Something moved across the table at that, a collective small adjustment, the kind that happened when a detail arrived that recontextualized everything around it. His daughter. The man who had built an architecture worth billions was working weekend banquet shifts and going home to his daughter, and the room was now doing the mathematics of that choice and arriving at something that sat in the chest differently than admiration. Desmond cleared his throat. It was a small sound, functionally unnecessary. The kind of throat clearing that people did when they needed a half-second to locate themselves before speaking and didn't want the silence to be more visible than it already was. The system, he said. Tonight. The breach. He paused, and what he was doing in the pause was visible to everyone at the table. He was trying to find language for something he didn't yet have the full vocabulary for. Your team at the FBI told Priya that the containment protocol wasn't holding. That's correct, Marcus said. And you, another pause. You knew something the protocol documentation didn't cover. I built a contingency into the original architecture, Marcus said. The documentation describes the system's designed responses. It doesn't describe the decisions I made that aren't in the documentation, because those decisions were meant to be a last resort. Tonight was a last resort. Desmond absorbed this. Around him, the table was very quiet. How long did it take you, the investor said, to resolve it? Marcus thought about it. 11 minutes from when I had the console access, maybe 3 more for the preparatory steps. The investor looked at Desmond. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Desmond picked up his wine glass and set it down again without drinking from it. He looked at the table surface for a moment with the expression of a man doing a kind of internal accounting that was not producing comfortable results. When he looked up, he looked at Marcus, and the look had shed most of what it had carried earlier in the evening. The performance, the casual contempt, the easy authority of a man who assumed his categories were correct. What remained was simpler and considerably less comfortable. Earlier tonight, Desmond said. His voice was low enough now that the table had to lean slightly to catch it. What I said, he stopped. The journalist had gone completely still. That was, he stopped again. You don't have to, Marcus said quietly. It wasn't mercy, exactly. It was something more like efficiency, the recognition that an incomplete apology delivered under maximum witness pressure served neither of them particularly well, and that some things were better handled in rooms that weren't watching. Desmond looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. And the room, which had been holding something without knowing it was holding it, exhaled. The service corridor looked exactly the same as it had at the beginning of the evening. This was the thing about back-of-house spaces. They didn't absorb the weight of what happened on the other side of the door. The fluorescent light was the same unsparing white. The stainless steel carts were in the same positions. The worn path down the center of the linoleum told the same story it always told, which was simply that people had been moving through here in the same direction for a very long time. Whatever had happened in the ballroom tonight, this room had no record of it. Marcus was at the staff hooks near the far wall, removing his apron when he heard the door. He didn't turn immediately. He folded the apron the way he always did, thirds lengthwise, then folded again and set it on the counter before he turned, because finishing what you started was a habit that didn't make exceptions for interruptions, regardless of who was doing the interrupting. Desmond Varro stood just inside the corridor door. He looked different here. Not smaller exactly, but differently scaled. The ballroom had been built for him, or for people like him, and he had occupied it with the ease of a man in his natural environment. This corridor was built for no one in particular, which meant it was built for everyone equally, and Desmond in it was just a man in an expensive suit standing on worn linoleum under fluorescent light, which was a different proposition entirely. He wasn't performing anything. That was the most visible difference. All evening his face had been arranged. Even in the moments of genuine pressure, there had been a layer of management to it. The habitual curation of a man who had spent decades ensuring that what people saw was what he intended them to see. In the corridor, with no audience and no purpose except the one that had brought him through the door, the curation was gone. What remained was something more unfinished and considerably more human. I wanted to. He started and then stopped, because whatever he'd planned to say on the other side of the door had apparently not survived the crossing. Marcus waited. Desmond looked at the folded apron on the counter, then at Marcus, then at some middle point between them. "Why didn't you say anything?" he said finally. "Earlier, at the table." He paused. "You just stood there." "I know." "You could have." He made a gesture that encompassed, vaguely, everything Marcus could have done. Said something. Done something. Made me look. He stopped. "I know," Marcus said again. Desmond seemed to find the repetition more difficult to manage than a longer answer would have been. He moved slightly, not pacing but the suggestion of it, the contained restlessness of a man accustomed to moving through discomfort rather than standing inside it. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "I know that too." "But that's not—" Desmond stopped. Tried again. "That's not actually the point, is it?" It wasn't a question. He was working something out in real time, and Marcus could see the working, the specific expression of a man whose usual tools weren't adequate to what he was trying to build. "The point isn't whether I knew who you were. The point is what I thought justified saying it when I thought you were just—" He didn't finish. "A server," Marcus said. Desmond looked at him directly. "Yes." The word sat between them for a moment, small and precise and doing considerable work. Marcus leaned against the counter beside the folded apron and considered Desmond Varro, not with hostility, not with the particular satisfaction that the evening might have entitled him to, but with the same clear attention he gave everything. What he saw was a man in genuine encounter with something he'd managed to avoid encountering for a very long time, and the encounter was uncomfortable in the way that genuine things often were. "I left Novatire 3 years ago," Marcus said. "My daughter has a chronic condition that requires consistent management, specialist appointments, medication adjustments, monitoring. She needed me present in a way that the work didn't allow." He let that settle before continuing. I took shifts that keep me near her schedule and close to her medical team. The work itself doesn't matter to me. The proximity does. Desmond listened without interrupting, which was itself notable. I didn't say anything at the table, Marcus continued, because there was nothing to say that would have served either of us. You'd already decided what I was. That kind of decision doesn't reverse in public, it just becomes a performance. He paused. I'm not interested in performances. Desmond was quiet for a moment. And now? He said. In here. Is this serving either of us? The question surprised Marcus slightly, not because it was sharp, but because it was honest. It was the most honest thing he'd heard from Desmond Varro all evening, and it arrived here, in a service corridor, with no audience and nothing to gain from it. I think so, Marcus said. Yes. Desmond nodded slowly. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. I'm not going to tell you that I'm a different person than what you saw tonight, he said. I don't think that would be. I don't think you'd believe it. And I think you're the kind of person who prefers accuracy to comfort. I am, Marcus said. Then accurately, he paused, choosing. I behaved badly. In front of people whose opinion I've spent considerable effort cultivating. And in front of you, whose opinion I had no framework for valuing until approximately 90 minutes ago, which is its own problem. He met Marcus's eyes. I'm sorry for what I said. The way I said it. The performance of it. He said the last word with a specific flatness that suggested he'd heard Marcus use it and had understood exactly what it meant applied to himself. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The apology was incomplete in the way that first apologies usually were. It still carried the fingerprints of the man who delivered the original offense, still had its edges, still wasn't quite large enough to fully cover what it was trying to cover. But it was real. Marcus had enough experience with the difference between real and performed to identify it without difficulty. Thank you, Marcus said. He meant it the way he meant most things, simply and completely without theater. Desmond nodded once. He looked like a man who had expected the corridor to feel different after saying what he'd come to say, and was adjusting to the discovery that it felt more or less the same, which was perhaps the more accurate outcome. He turned toward the door. Mr. Varro, Marcus said. Desmond stopped. The timestamp vulnerability in the authentication layer. Make sure your team doesn't just patch it, have them audit the entire verification sequence for similar gaps. The person who found that exploit tonight knew the system well enough to look for structural logic errors, not surface flaws. He paused. Which means they may have mapped more than one. Desmond turned back. He looked at Marcus for a moment with an expression that had nothing left in it from the earlier performance. Just a man receiving information he needed from someone he had not, until tonight, known to ask. I'll have Gordon call you, he said. He has my number through Priya, Marcus said. I'll be available Monday. Desmond looked at him for one more moment, something working behind his eyes that hadn't resolved into language yet and perhaps wouldn't tonight, and then he turned and pushed through the door and was gone. The corridor resumed its silence. Marcus picked up his jacket from the hook, checked his phone, one message from Clara, a photograph of Lily asleep with the book still open on her chest, which made something in him go very quiet and very warm simultaneously, and walked toward the exit at the far end of the corridor. The city at 11:40 on a Saturday night was a different thing than the city at any other hour. It wasn't quieter exactly. There was still traffic on the main roads, still the distant percussion of music from somewhere Marcus couldn't identify, still the particular ambient hum of a place that never fully stopped. But it had a different quality, a looseness. The way a face looks different when it's stopped performing for the day and is just existing in the dark. Marcus walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop, with his jacket over one arm and the small notebook in his breast pocket, and the photograph of Lily still open on his phone screen. She was exactly as Clara had described, asleep with the book still open on her chest, her face arranged in the specific piece of a child who had gone down mid-chapter and hadn't noticed. The reading lamp beside her was still on, casting the warm light that made the photograph look like something painted rather than taken. Marcus looked at it for the length of time it took to reach the bus stop, which was enough. He put his phone away and waited. The bus came at 11:51, 2 minutes behind schedule, and he rode it the way he always rode it. Near the window, the city moving past in its late-night register, the handful of other passengers dispersed through the car in the way of people who had learned to take space when space was available. He didn't think about Desmond Varro on the bus. He didn't think about the ballroom or the podium or Castellan's voice dropping his name into that specific silence. He thought about Lily's dosage adjustment and whether the new schedule would need further refinement, and about the thriller he'd abandoned halfway through at the hospital waiting room, and about whether the fountain in the civic square would catch the morning light the same way it caught the noon light, which was a question he and Lily had not yet investigated. He walked from the bus stop to his building in 12 minutes. Clara opened the door before he knocked, which was something she did. She had a particular sensitivity to footsteps in the hallway that she claimed was a residual condition of 30 years of classroom management. She reported on Lily with the thoroughness of a professional who understood that the details mattered. The 3rd chapter had been finished after all. The medication had been taken without negotiation. The night had been entirely unremarkable in the best possible way. Marcus thanked her in the way he always thanked her, which she always received, with the same mild impatience of someone who felt the thanks were disproportionate to the service. He walked her to the door and made sure she was safely across the hall before he went to Lily's room. She was still asleep. The book had been moved from her chest to the nightstand at some point, Clara's doing, but the reading lamp was still on, and Lily was on her side facing the window with the particular solidity of deep sleep, the kind that doesn't register footsteps or light or the soft presence of a father, sitting on the edge of the bed. Marcus sat for a while. He wasn't thinking about anything specific. This was one of the things he'd learned about these moments, that they didn't require thought, that the value of them was precisely in their resistance to meaning, in the fact that they were just presence without agenda, a man and his daughter and a reading lamp and the city doing its late night thing outside the window. He had sat in this chair in this configuration through hospital nights and bad medication weeks and the particular grief of the first year after her mother died, and the chair had absorbed all of it without changing, which was one of the things he appreciated about chairs. After a while, Lily shifted and made a small sound and went deeper. He turned off the reading lamp and went to the kitchen. The medication chart on the refrigerator had Dr. Fennick's new schedule written in his careful handwriting at the bottom, the ink still slightly fresher than the entries above it. The framed photograph on the windowsill caught the ambient streetlight the way it caught the morning sun, differently, but still catching it, still there. He made tea because it was that kind of hour, and stood at the counter with it and let the evening settle into whatever shape it was going to take. His phone buzzed at 12:23. A message from Priya Solis. He'd half expected it. She was the kind of person who moved quickly on things once she'd decided to move, and the decision had been visible in her face from the moment she'd handed him the pen in the corridor. "I want to be clear this isn't on his behalf," it read. "There's a Federal Infrastructure Advisory Panel, civilian, independent, that has been looking for someone with your specific profile for 8 months. I sit on the selection committee in an independent capacity. I should have made this connection sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Would you be open to a conversation this week? Marcus read it twice. He set the phone face down on the counter and looked at the kitchen, the medication chart, the photograph, the 2 mugs on the drying rack, because Clara always used the same one, and he always used the same one, and they'd stopped discussing it. The homework Lily had left spread across the table before bed, a worksheet about fractions with a drawing of a pizza in the corner that had nothing to do with the assignment and everything to do with Lily. He thought about the fountain in the civic square. He thought about what he'd told Lily on the bus, that some of the people who built it knew about the diamonds, and some of them were just trying to build something good. He picked up the phone. He read the message one more time. Then he began to type. The reply was 4 words, which was enough. Tuesday works. Thank you. He finished his tea standing at the counter, and then he rinsed the mug and set it on the rack beside Clara's, and turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Outside, the city continued its quiet work, indifferent, unhurried, full of people in corridors and ballrooms and bus seats and kitchen counters, each of them the protagonist of something the room they were standing in didn't yet know how to see. Some of them would be seen eventually. Some of them were already waiting, with the patience of people who had decided that being seen on someone else's timeline was a form of control they were no longer willing to give away. Marcus Hale slept. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, The Surgeon Laughed at the Old Janitor's Hands, until the power went out. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?